We all set? Yep, great. I see your lips moving. Let me just say thanks to Dave, because in all the years working in a church, I learned how essential volunteers were, but there are always those guys and gals who stand apart because they commit themselves for an interval of time. And an interval can be a few weeks, or it can be a year or a few years, and it can mean different things. And David is one of those guys who, in my last years at the church, stuck with it, sometimes longer than he thought he was going to. On stewardship committee, I know. But now he's really been holding down the fort with Seekers for a few years and is helping with our stewardship in a more active way. And so let me just say thank you to David for being exceptional and making such a big difference. Thank you. I see the head nod. You heard that. Good. God bless. The scripture for today and the topic is one that's become dearer to my heart the older I get. And it's the topic today, of course, is a type of fear. And it's a fear that leads to hopelessness or a depression of some kind that involves the lack of believing that you have a future, or a good future at least. And so the story comes from the book of 1 Kings, and we're going to be looking at chapter 19. And it's the episode that has Elijah, after the confrontation with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, it has him losing hope and running for his life, or really running away from his life, you might put it. So we'll look at the scripture in a minute. Let me give you some background from chapter 18 and the chapters before that. Elijah had been commissioned by God to be the main prophet of Israel. And what you can pick up by reading about the prophets all through the Old Testament is that there was always more than one prophet on the scene. The religious organization, let's call that, of the Jewish people at this time was very fragmented and very broken up. The kingdom had been divided into a northern and southern kingdom. The southern kingdom was in Jerusalem and the tribe of Benjamin, Judea. And it was in the area of southern Israel, basically down to the Negev desert. But right above that, the northern kingdom started, and the northern kingdom included the other 10 tribes of Israel. They had their own king. They had broken away after the death of Solomon and his son, who had imposed much higher taxes, and the northern kingdom had rebelled. So instead of going to Jerusalem for the Passover every year, the northern kingdom built its own temple, so to speak, on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. And that is up much more toward Nazareth of today. And so they had their separate rulers, they had their separate priests of Yahweh, of the religion of Moses and the Israelites. But they were also much looser in terms of their faithfulness to God because of that separation from the temple in Jerusalem. And so the kings of the northern tribes tended to have a wider geography to take care of. The 10 tribes of Israel went all the way to the Mediterranean coast, and they went to the east of the Jordan River. And so they were spread out into areas where other cultures and nations usually carried a lot of weight. On the west, the Mediterranean coast, you had the Philistines had become the Phoenicians, and then you had the major trading towns of Tyre and Sidon, which were really along the Mediterranean coast in modern day Lebanon. And then you had the more mountain hill country kingdoms of Syria and the Amalekites and the Amalekites. And you see the other nations who are not Jewish intruding on northern 10 tribes often. So a lot of warfare, a lot of defending the turf, because the kingdoms of David and Solomon had declined, and now it was up to the northern king and the southern king to try to hold things together. But they were always under warfare, under pressure. And so in that setting, God called prophets to be in both kingdoms. The prophets were probably even more important, though, in the northern kingdom because of the lack of a central priesthood that was loyal to Jerusalem and the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. And so what you've got here is bands of prophets, or a major band of prophets that you can get allusions to in the book of First Kings. For instance, what has happened in this story is that a lot of the prophets have been killed by the northern king, King Ahab, and his wife Jezebel. And so Elijah is one of the last remaining prophets. Some of the prophets have been saved or rescued and hidden in a cave by the steward, or the major Kent Murphey type of person, administrator for the northern king, the northern kingdom's king, who was faithful to the religion of the south. But he had risked his life and his family, of course, to really take some of the prophets that were about to be executed and hide them for several years in northern Israel. I don't know why they didn't go into southern Israel. Maybe the borders were too risky to cross. But basically, in this setting, you have the major prophet Elijah, who was kind of like the lead prophet. The lifestyle of these guys was very much like John the Baptist. They lived in the wilderness. They didn't live in cities. Sometimes they would have mentors, or what would you call them, sponsors, I guess. In Elijah's life, you have the widow up in a North Lebanon area town, who really puts him up during a major drought and famine and feeds him. And this is the story of the woman with the jar of oil and grain that never runs out because she's about to die, and Elijah asks God to save her. This is the one whose son died, and then Elijah brought back to life. And so earlier in the book of Kings, we see these stories of God using Elijah to confront the northern king and his wife, Ahab and Jezebel, and also to kind of be the linchpin person who everyone who wants to be faithful to God in northern Israel can do so. There's a leader. They're not seeing or hearing him all the time, but they know he's out there, and they know he's alive, and they know he has the guts to speak the truth that God gives him to speak to King Ahab. So there's someone that they can have hope in. There's an earthly representative of God, even though that representative and the prophets, most of them have been locked away or killed. You still have Elijah. Elijah's out there somewhere, and he makes appearances here and there. And when he does, people who know who he is, say, hey, God's still alive and well and caring about us here in northern Israel. In a way, going through the famine that they went through along with the pagan northern kingdom peoples caused a lot of suffering, but they could see the purpose, and they could feel that God understood and was with them if they saw an earthly representative, much like Christians can by looking at Christ and seeing that God didn't forget his people, but sent his son into the world. So that's the background here. And what's just happened before chapter 19 is God has led Elijah to a major confrontation with the competitive religion of the Mediterranean coast, the religion of Tyre and Sidon. And this was a god that was very much like the other pagan gods all around Israel. It was a polytheism. There were multiple gods, a lot of nature gods, but the major gods were fertility gods. And this was the major competitive religious um, structure or form or theology that the religion of the Jews really competed with. Jewish faith being monotheistic and being a moralistic faith with commandments, and loyalty to God being described as following those commandments, which were really commandments of restraint rather than permissiveness. Whereas the Canaanite and the pagan and the Baalism religions were fertility religions, which were much more ancient in their format, because the whole point of fertility religions was that people had to eat. And the elements, rain, sunshine, the weather, the soil, the fact that if a crop didn't take one spring and summer, there would be famine and starvation. If an army invaded and you didn't have spare food, you might starve. If the trees didn't bear fruit, if the fields didn't bear grain. Basically, if the sheep didn't have little sheep and goats, little goats, and all of that, if the cows didn't give milk, if it didn't rain, you basically had a natural disaster. And so fertility is a broad concept here. It basically means nature working at its best to support the people that live in that area. And so the gods of fertility religions were all gods that were appealed to in order to enhance pragmatic productivity, if I could use that fancy way of putting it. You wanted to have good crops. You wanted people to eat. If you were a king or a queen and it was up to you to keep the people happy and to keep the enemies from invading successfully and your country being taken over, you cared about fertility. You cared about the people eating and the armies having grain to march on and all of that. So this is the religion that the Jews find themselves in the middle of. So what happens is the northern king Ahab, really his father Omri, is someone who is a military commander who usurps the throne and has a rebellion. And he's really, there's a purge, and he kills the hereditary king that goes back to Solomon. And he's a very pragmatic ruler. He's not someone we hear a lot of, but Omri was someone who made alliances, which was a very smart thing to do, treaties, so to speak. And we're talking right now in our country about what will happen with our alliances with our European allies or our Asian allies under a new president. Will they be better or worse? Who knows? But basically, alliances is what countries do when they're not at war, and they don't necessarily want to go to war anytime soon that they can avoid. So Omri is very politically adept. He's a military commander. He doesn't want to spend the rest of his time fighting. So he makes alliances to the east with Syria. He makes alliances to the west with Tyre and Sidon and the very rich kings that were basically had naval empires that really handled much of the Mediterranean trade, and also received caravan trade, of course, from the land to the east, perhaps all the way from India and therefore from China at that time, the myrrh and the frankincense and the spices that were so in demand that came overland to the port cities of the Mediterranean, and then were sold with markups all along the way. So basically, Omri makes these alliances, and Ahab, his son, inherits them. And Ahab has a great idea. He says, I'll go even better than Dad. I'll marry the princess of Tyre. Okay, and he hears about and is introduced to, and the king of Tyre wants an alliance with the land kingdom to his east. He doesn't want to be unprotected. He'd love to have a buffer state to protect his island kingdom of Tyre, basically, and the lands that are on shore that handle all the merchandise. And so he makes this alliance by marrying his daughter Jezebel to King Ahab, the king of the Israelite northern 10 tribes. The thing is that the king of Tyre was also the king was also the high priest of Baal, okay? And they had a different name, Melkort, for him. And the king of Tyre actually has that name, Melkort, in his name. And it basically means the son or the favored of Melkort, or the god, head god of the Baal worshiping religion. But Baal was the mountaintop god, or the heavenly god of the region of Tyre. And so Jezebel is a very devout princess. Her father was the high priest, okay, of that area. She's coming from the Ivy League schools of that time in that area. She's coming from the most rich countries in that whole known part of the world. They're the first world, and she's going down to the second world. Maybe sometimes it felt like the third world, to Jezebel. And she's going with a mission. She's going to raise up that backward nation of Israel with her husband Ahab's support to bring them into the modern world, the world of commerce, the world of military success, and the world that gets it. The way you get those things is by worshiping the fertility god Baal. Well, we know the history of Israel, and we know that Israel had already gone through a time when it was led into Baal worship with the golden calf. And if you think about a golden calf, the bull, or the young bull, is the symbol of fertility, one of the major ones in agricultural religions. If you were a young, strong man, they called you a bull, okay? You had virility, you had fertility, you had strength, you were a good fighter, you were someone people listened to, you were someone that got promoted and promoted and promoted in whatever field you were in, because you were a bull in a china shop, so to speak. And so basically, Israelites had a history with Baal that we have a major story about in the wanderings in the wilderness. But all along, as they got into Canaan and the land of Israel and the promised land, they had been tempted and led into the possibility of worshiping both Yahweh, the monotheistic God, and Baal. And of course, Baal had a consort, Ashtaroth, who was the female counterpart. And so the northern kingdom, most of the people, probably maybe 95 or more percent of them, were worshiping Baal under the leadership of Jezebel. And it was the PC, the politically correct thing to do. How could you be successful and be blessed by the king, given contracts, given business, have connections, have good social ties, unless you went to the church of Baal, okay? This was the church on the hilltop at that time. And the church of the faithful to the God of Moses, the God of the Ten Commandments, and the God of Elijah were really almost had to be secretive. I mean, hadn't Jezebel rounded up and killed hundreds and hundreds of the prophets of Yahweh, of Jehovah? And so Elijah is kind of hiding out. He makes brief appearances and then he goes into hiding again. And so he comes out of his cave, so to speak, his hiding place, and he outwardly challenges. It's kind of like, okay, corral time. We're gonna call the question, and we're gonna take a vote, and we're gonna ask our gods to appear in some way, to show their power in some way, and prove which one is real, which one is connected enough to his prophets that the people can reasonably be called upon to trust in that God versus the other God. And so it's Baal versus Yahweh, the God of Elijah, of Moses, of Abraham, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so this is what happens on Mount Carmel. It's a very dramatic story, very detailed. First Kings is probably being written in its final form with many of these stories gathered together either during or after the exile, hundreds of years after these events. So this story is part of the Jewish tradition that is important and helps explain to the Jews and to us what happened with the Jewish nation when they went into exile and how eventually God allowed that to happen so that they could be readied for the coming of Christ hundreds of years later and have a tradition of faithfulness, but also of rebellion against God and the consequences that came from that. So a lot of the stories we see, the story of Jonah, the prophet, the story of Job, and this story of Elijah is a story of a really struggle to be faithful and to be hopeful about God versus the alternatives and the competition that is around us in our world, just as it is and was around in their world. So that's what's happened on Mount Carmel. The two sides, the two groups of priests and prophets, Elijah by himself, okay, building the fire pit and digging a trench around it and pouring water into it. And of course, Elijah had assistants and helpers to help with this, to haul the water up to the mountaintop. But basically, you have this pile of wood. You have a bull or bulls that have been sacrificed and laid on the fire to be burned so that the burning of their flesh is smoke that goes up to God and indicates that someone has made a serious, costly sacrifice out of respect and worship and appeal to God. And so you have the water trench of fire around it so that there's no way it can be really lit, maybe on the sly, or maybe it can't be, someone can't run around behind it and hide and set it on fire and pretend that God set the whole thing on fire. Because what calling on their gods to do on Mount Carmel is to basically strike it with lightning and set it on fire. In other words, we're going to pray, we're going to worship, we're going to dance, we're going to do whatever we do around our separate piles of wood with the sacrifice ready to be consumed by fire. And we're going to ask God to light it or Baal to light that pyre. And whichever one does it is real. Whichever one doesn't is the one that the people should not follow. And those priests and prophets should either leave in despair and shame, or maybe should even be done away with because they would lead others astray. So it's a time where the truth is going to come out in a very clear way. It's a time where there's a confrontation. It's the OK Corral. And what happens is that the priests of Baal for an entire day dance and they cut themselves to bleed. They flagellate themselves. They go through all the contortions that priests and prophets did for Baal, because you were supposed to do everything you could, including human sacrifice at times, sacrifice of infants, to show that fertility god that you needed them and that without them you would die too. And so you went to the point of death when you worshiped a fertility god. When you think back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham carrying Isaac to the mount, it was a Mount Moriah, I believe, and being told, go sacrifice your son. I don't know whether you realize it, but really what Abraham's being told to do by God before he realizes what's going to happen and what has happened is he's being told to go worship God, the God you and I worship, in the manner of the pagan fertility religions that said, take your firstborn son and sacrifice him for me, and you will prove that you love and are faithful to me, your God. Now that was going on all around Abraham. That was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. That was going on in Syria. That was going in Tyre. That was going in on every fertility religion around the Middle East. So what's happening there, without it really staying so obviously, is that Abraham's being told to worship our God and his God in the way other gods were worshipped, to prove to our God and Abraham's God, that Abraham loved him, our God, as much as the other people loved their God. And so Abraham does it. You know what happens. You know the story. He lays Isaac out. He ties his hands. He's raised the knife. He's got him laid on a pile of wood because he's going to kill him, sacrifice him, and then burn him so that the smoke goes up to heaven. And so basically the idea being that God could smell the sacrifice and we'd get God's attention that it was really happening. But of course, we know that God already had Abraham in his mind. He didn't have to get appealed to. We didn't need to wake him up or get his attention. Abraham, was told, an angel came and grabbed his arm pretty much and said, "Stop before you kill your son. Over in the thicket of thorns or weeds is the ram. Take your son down, untie him, and sacrifice this ram that God has provided for your sacrifice instead." And that wonderful story, if you get it and you can realize that this is what's happening here with Elijah, is really kind of happening again. You have the idea of God setting himself as apart and different in the way we worship him. And the way we worship him, if I have to underline it, is we worship him through the sacrifice that God has prepared and provided for us. A wonderful type or picture or analogy to what God is going to do centuries later by providing the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, right? Isn't that what Christ is to us? We don't have to sacrifice our children. We don't have to sacrifice ourselves. We don't have to prove in some way that we are worthy of God, because we're not. There's nothing we can do. What we have to do is put our faith in the sacrifice that God has provided in Jesus Christ, the ram in the thicket, the sheep, okay, that God has sent, the Paschal Passover lamb. And so we have in the story of Mount Carmel, the story of great victory, where God shows the people of Israel that he is the God, because the Baal priests dance and do all these worship, extreme forms of pagan worship, doing everything they humanly can and getting no result. And finally, Elijah kind of, it's funny, Elijah taunts them. He says, "Why don't you shout louder? Why don't you dance harder? Maybe Baal is sleeping. Maybe you need to wake him up." In other words, you need to do something to get his attention, because obviously your pile of branches and your sacrifice bulls are not on fire. And so they work even harder. They do it even, and they get exhausted. And then Elijah sees that all the people gathered around the mountain have seen the failure of the priests and the prophets of Baal. And he basically calls upon God, and God does send fire. And the pile of wood and the bull are consumed, and the people see it. And they realize that the God of Elijah, the God of the vast minority in their northern kingdom, is real. And they realize that the God of Israel, the real God, cares about them, that God can make an appearance in the northern kingdom, that God isn't the God of the southern kingdom only, that God is bigger than that. He's not someone who holds a grudge against them because they're Samaritans and because they're a northern kingdom, but that God is waiting for all people to worship him. And so the people of the northern kingdom react, and they take the priests of Baal and they basically put them to the sword. They execute them. They did it without great detail in the scripture. I would imagine they did it really in vengeance for being led astray. They had suffered had several years of famine and drought. They had seen many people die. It would be as if we could pin COVID and all that we've gone through and are going through and maybe still will go through on a particular group of people who had kept healing or something, or the solutions from coming. And the anger, when they realized that that was so in an indisputable way, was something that made them react. And so the priests of Baal are now dead. as are many of the priests and the prophets of Yahweh, Elijah's God. But Elijah has proven that the God of Israel is real, and the God of Baal is at best sleeping or not caring about the people of the northern kingdom. And so this is where we pick up with in chapter 19. Sorry for the amount of time, but it's such a wonderful story to tell. It says in chapter 19, now Ahab told Jezebel, the queen, everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Elijah's being blamed because the people killed the prophets of Baal, Jezebel's prophets that had dinner with her every day in the palace with Jezebel. See, Jezebel was a very devout Baal worshiper. She was a booster or a philanthropist and supported the religion of Baal. She fed the prophets. She kept them going. She was their sponsor in a money important way. During the plague and the famine, she made sure they got fat. The people might be starving, but they ate at the queen's table. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods, plural, deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. Okay. So in other words, may my gods or the gods or all the gods deal with me and punish me if by 24 hours from now, from the time you hear this message, I don't make your life like that of one of them. In other words, I don't have you executed too. People wonder why she sent a messenger or why she didn't send an assassin. Okay, we don't know. It may be that her intention was to get rid of him, because if she killed him outright, it was too soon politically for her to kill the guy that just the day or two before had shown the power of that God on the top of Mount Carmel. Maybe she was afraid, but she wasn't afraid enough not to threaten Elijah. And so Elijah hears this and is afraid. Verse 3 of chapter 19, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. He ran for his life. He didn't just run. He didn't just get away or get out of danger. He runs for his life. He is afraid he's about to be killed by Jezebel and her soldiers who are on the way probably. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, okay, that's the southernmost town in the southern kingdom. So he runs to the south. He's starting out around Mount Carmel, really at southern Lebanon, and he's going all the way down to the start of the Negev desert, way south of Jerusalem. So he's running for his life as fast as he can. He's running a marathon, basically. If you've been to Israel or studied Israel, you know that this is many tens of miles. So he's going as fast as he can. He goes to the southernmost city. He says he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. So he goes down into the desert out of the town of Beersheba alone. And he came to a broom tree, a small tree, a desert kind of scruffy tree, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors, which was a way of saying, I don't have any life left in me. I'm basically as dead as they are, or about to be. I have no future. I am not, my ancestors are in the ground. They have no future, neither do I. Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. The description here doesn't really do justice to the exhaustion that he must have felt after, in fear, running as fast as he humanly possibly could, all the way down through Israel to get to the lowest, furthest place away from Jezebel as he could get. And then he falls asleep in exhaustion. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. And so he ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Or the journey is too much. It's interesting that it's not has been or was too much. Elijah is still in the middle of his journey. It's almost like the journey goes beyond what just happened into the past and stretches out in the future in some unknown way or unknown time. But it's almost like it's not just the trip south from Mount Carmel has been too much, but the journey is too much for you. The ministry, the life of service, the whole thing. It's been too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. So he is on a pilgrimage south. He's going down to Mount Horeb or Sinai. He's going down to the mountain of the Ten Commandments. So he's way out in the wilderness of Sinai, way down south of civilized territory. And so he's gone and he's taken it's been a slow 40 days to get there. I imagine somebody with a cane, hobbling, limping along, heading toward Mount Sinai, really reaching out for God, being told to go there. And so there he went into a cave and spent the night. The story of Moses seeing God in the the Exodus, of hiding in the cleft of the rock or the cave of the rock on Mount Sinai while God passes by, is what we're picturing here, or we could picture here. And so the word of the Lord in verse 9 comes to Elijah, and God does what he does often with people in their stories of an encounter with God in the Bible. He asks a question. He asks Job a question, doesn't he, when he appears before to Job? He asks many different people, Adam and Eve. He asks a question: why are you hiding? Okay, or why are you naked? Who told you you were naked? There's a question often that comes from God to us that calls us to think and reflect and respond. And so he says to Elijah, what are you doing here, Elijah? In other words, I've called you to be a prophet in Israel, the 10 northern tribes, but here you are on Mount Sinai, about as far away as you can get in the world. And what are you doing here? Now, God knows what's happened. God knows about it all. God sent the angel to feed and strengthen Elijah so he would survive the exhausting journey. But God calls Elijah to think. And Elijah replies, I have been very zealous. I've worked very hard for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. So God is about to walk by, so to speak, the feet of the Lord, or the movement of God in the material and world of matter and energy in this earth is about to happen. And so then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Okay, so God appears to Elijah, but in a unique way. The wind, the rain, the earthquake, the fire, we can think back in the stories of the Old Testament and find times when God makes an appearance in those ways. And basically, we see that, the bush that wasn't consumed by fire. We see the earthquakes that probably caused the parting of the Red Sea. We probably see the wind in the story of Job, the great storm in which God's voice comes to Job. And so instead of all those pictures of power and overwhelming might, what we see the gentleness of God, or the kindness, or the whisper, as it says. And Elijah didn't see God or hear God in the powerful things, but he saw God in the most gentle and subtle thing, the whisper. And we don't know what the whisper said, but Elijah recognized it as God. And he pulls his cloak over his face. He hides his face because he doesn't want to see the holiness of God. God's there in that whisper, and Elijah, in fear and trembling, covers his own face, and he stands in the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Same question. What are you doing here? And Elijah answers the same way. I've been very zealous. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, put your prophets to death with a sword, and now they are trying to kill me too. So Elijah hangs tough with his self-perception, his self-pity, his very skewed, inaccurate self-assessment and assessment of the situation around him. Then the Lord says, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus." Go past where you came, really, if he's going to the desert of Damascus, Syria. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. So in other words, go to the northern kingdom of Israel, but keep going, cross the Jordan and go into Syria and find the king of the Syrians of Aram, and also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elijah, son of Shaphat from Abel Maholah, to succeed you as prophet. So what God is giving Elijah to do here is really a passing of the baton, not only of Elijah's prophetic ministry, but of the leadership of the Syrians and the leadership of the northern kingdom. Jehu wasn't king. Ahab was still king and alive, but Jehu was anointed, very much like David was anointed by Samuel earlier in time, when he was just a shepherd boy. He's anointed because it's a sign that God has chosen this person to be the future king. If I was the king of one of these countries, and the current king, and someone was anointed by a prophet of God to become the king, I would know my days were numbered. Much like Saul knew his days were numbered when Samuel, the prophet of God, anointed David, the shepherd boy. And we have the story in detail of Saul's jealousy about David before he met his own death and David became king. And so what Elijah's being told to do is to pass the baton and give God's approval for the new king of Syria, to the future king of the northern kingdom, and then also the next prophet, major prophet, to follow Elijah. And it's not even someone, Elisha, S-H-A, instead of Elijah, okay? And basically the name Elijah means Jehovah, or Yahweh is God, El, okay? Elisha, okay, Elisha. Eli, Eli, says Jesus on the cross, my God, my God is Jehovah, is the name Elijah. Excuse me. Elisha is my God is salvation, okay? And so basically Elisha, excuse me, the next prophet is the one that is going to be anointed, and he says him, Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael the Syrian, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve, says God to Elijah, I reserve 7,000 in Israel, the northern kingdom. I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. And that's really the end of our scripture. Elijah goes forth from there, finds Elisha, he goes and he does the other anointings, and he basically passes the baton. And Elisha becomes the attendant or the assistant for Elijah. Elijah is going to be around a while longer in his ministry, but Elijah is the heir apparent to the prophetic ministry that God has to conduct among the people of the northern kingdom. So this is the story of a seasoned, very, I guess, a very accomplished person, the main man, so to speak, Elijah, among the people of Israel at one of the most difficult times, a very lonely time, a time where when God finally acts in the most mighty way, Elijah somehow forgets that the God who sent lightning from heaven can also protect him. And Elijah runs for his life. And he has no future other than death, and he's running from it in his own mind. He feels like God has abandoned him. People wonder when they comment on this passage whether Elijah thought in his own mind that, hey, God has acted and Baal has not. Maybe even Jezebel, the princess of Tyre, will renounce Baal and accept the God of Israel. And of course, the opposite happens. Jezebel swears that she's going to kill Elijah in spite of what God just did. And so she's bitter, she's angry, and somehow that just is the final straw for Elijah. Who knows? Maybe we can only speculate why that was the linchpin that broke Elijah's nerve and his courage. But he runs away, and in a way that I think most of us recognize to some degree, he despairs. And in our despair, in Elijah's despair, we overblow and we analyze our situation in the most negative way. We can see where God knows that 7,000 people are still faithful in the northern kingdom. Elijah doesn't see that 7,000. Elijah doesn't remember that the people had put the prophets of Baal to death, and that there was a much brighter future because there wouldn't be competitive prophets and priests calling people to be loyal all over the 10 tribes of Israel, all over the geography of northern Israel. Jezebel might still be faithful to Baal, but she didn't have an army of prophets anymore to basically push her religion on the people. So like Elijah, haven't you or haven't I know I have, often had a time or times where we really only see the downside or only see the negative. Isn't that human, and isn't that the way it is? And what's beautiful here is that God sees that, accepts that, and he comes to us not with power of wind, not with a booming preacher calling us on the phone saying, buck up and get with it, and giving us a lecture or a sermon, but God basically shows himself to us sooner or later with some gentle whisper in some kind, soft way. And I think a lot of us in our class, we've got a lot of years of experience in our journey. And there have been times when we probably felt like the journey was too much for us, as the angels said to Elijah. But God doesn't give up on us. God does realize that our journey doesn't last forever, and that our journey goes through phases. What's also beautiful here is that God didn't just say, well, Elisha, turn in your keys, and here's your gold watch, and it's time for you to retire, and I won't ask anything else of you. But God basically says to Elijah, okay, I hear you, I see it, but I still have more for you to do. And he sends Elijah to do the very important job of passing on the ministry and the leadership that Elijah had been entrusted with for those decades of his life. And so for us as older men and older women, I think this is why this passage and this story becomes even more precious, because it says how God feels, I think, about you and me. It says how God sees us now, perhaps, if we might look back and say, I was much more active as a servant, or I had much more of a definite role, or I had much more of an important thing to do. But God doesn't see it that way. God sees our life as a journey, and he sees us as people with a mission that never ends until he calls us home from this world. And so the key for you and me is to be open to that whisper and to realize that it's okay to feel fear and hopelessness, because that doesn't mean that God has given up on us. The thing to do is to stay open to the whisper when it comes, and to hear in that whisper what God has for us to do now and next, as long as he keeps us in this world. Let me ask for your reactions to this passage and scripture. What do you see in this that speaks to you? What do you see in this that you'd like to point out to the other people in the class? And I'll just shut up a minute and ask you to unmute and throw in your points if you'd like to at this point.
This is a story we've heard several times before, Kent, but thanks for breathing new life into it. It was interesting the way you presented it.
Well, thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. Yeah. I hear a church service in the background. I hope you guys can worship today and watch it and either be there or hear it. And
it's another Sunday school class.
Oh, is it? Good. Well, I just want to say thank you to you all for sticking with me for 4 weeks here. And of course, know that if I'm not with you every Sunday, I have you on my hearts, and I look forward to running into you, hearing from you, reaching out to you, and seeing you again sometime in Seekers, okay? Thanks for all that you do in your ministries at First Baptist and in your personal lives. Stay safe and be kind to one another, and continue to serve the Lord wherever he calls you to. God bless you all.
God bless you, Ken.
You do a great job of research and presentation and application, and we really appreciate your teaching.
Thank you, Cheryl. I hope I can do it again soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you,
Yeah,
Ken.
you bet.
Good job.
Take care now, Jim. Bye-bye now.
Amen.
Thank you, Kent.
Sure, you betcha.